Hello everybody, this is the third and last review video I'll be creating for you. It'll cover what the College Board considers to be Unit 3 material. Again, it's all stuff that we've covered. You probably have a pretty good handle on it. So do what you want. You can leave the sound on, turn the sound off. You can pause it and take notes. You can just sort of watch the information go by. I always recommend taking notes, but you do what you think is best at this point. The first main topic in Unit 3 is what we call civil society. Remember, we've studied this before. Civil society comprises any kind of voluntary association that people might create independent from the state, independent from the government. It's any kind of group that citizens can create or freely join. They are separate from the government. They can't be... Businesses are not considered to be part of civil society, but any other sort of group that you might join or create just because it fits your interests, would be part of what we call civil society. It includes what we would call interest groups in this country. Remember that an interest group specifically exists to influence the government. That's part of their definition. NGOs, which kind of overlaps with interest groups, but typically you see NGOs also providing some sort of service that ordinarily would be provided by a government but might not be in a particular country. For example, in this country, you would call the Red Cross an NGO. In some countries, the government makes sure there's an adequate blood supply for the population, but in this country, our government does not really get involved in that. So we have NGOs like the Red Cross that do that. And then civil society also encompasses endless variety of formal or informal groups that citizens just create. It can be something as simple as a book club that you organize with your friends. It could be something as grand as, a human rights watch organization that operates globally. Civil society encompasses all of those examples. Here are some very short list of possible examples of, let's say, NGOs: Amnesty International, Red Cross, and Red Crescent. Red Crescent is the version of the Red Cross that operates in Muslim countries. Doctors Without Borders. There's lots and lots of NGOs that work internationally. Those are just three examples. When it comes to interest groups, now these are examples from American society that would not go up on a test, but most countries have analogs of these. The AMA and the ABA are our professional associations for doctors and lawyers. The AFL-CIO is our biggest labor union. Labor unions are included in civil society. Then there's other more citizen-oriented groups like AARP speaks for old people, NAACP speaks for minorities in this country, the ACLU defends our Bill of Rights, the NRA is for gun advocates. Those are examples of interest groups that could exist almost in any country. And then miscellaneous groups, that could be religiously based. It could be devoted to youth groups like Cub Scouts or Boys and Girls Clubs. It could be community groups like Rotary and the Elks Clubs. I mean, anything that exists to express citizens' desires and goals and activities that all fall into the rubric of civil society. Like the examples that we just noted, most civil society groups are not explicitly political. The interest groups that exist to influence the government, they would be considered political, but most are not. The United States has an estimated 1.5 million civil society groups. Most of them are just, so citizens can kind of go about their business and make their lives better. The health or the robustness of a country's civil society is often an indicator of its degree of democratization. If a country has a large and active civil society, then you can probably conclude that there is a widespread respect on the part of the government for civil liberties. You can probably assume that to some degree, those civil society organizations help expose and limit government corruption. You can probably assume that the people in a country with lots and lots of civil society groups have a high degree of political efficacy and that they participate politically in high levels. You could probably infer that lots of civil society groups in a country means that these groups exist partly to express the wishes of the people to the government through lobbying and similar activities. a country that does not have a healthy, large, or robust civil society, you can pretty much assume the opposite of all those points. If we look at just democratic regimes among the countries that we study, we'll notice that the UK, Nigeria, and Mexico have civil society environments pretty similar to the United States with some differences. Let's look at the UK first. It's a unitary system, so there are fewer of what we would call interest groups, since, one of the things that makes interest groups proliferate in our society is our federal form of government, because there's so many governments that exist to be influenced, so there's lots of interest groups forming to influence those governments. There's only one level of government in the UK, so and within that government there's only one really powerful branch, let's say. So the number of interest groups there is fewer than you might see in other countries, but otherwise pretty similar to us. Very healthy and large active civil society there. They have a long list of civil liberties, freedom of speech and assembly going back hundreds of years, that encourages civil society groups to form. Unlike Nigeria, that hasn't been around that long, so its democracy is a little bit more unstable. But for only been around for about 60 years, the civil society scene in Nigeria is pretty good. Lots of civil society groups, very diverse, like the country itself. Wide variety of types of groups: community-based, national, business, labor, the whole panoply that you see in our country. A positive sign coming out of Nigeria, aren't that many usually, but here's one positive one. A couple years ago, in 2018, the Nigerian legislature was considering passing a law that would have gone a long way towards restricting the behavior of NGOs, but kind of Nigerian civil society groups to the rescue. They organized, they effectively fought the passage of that particular law and actually ended up blocking it. Lots of other African countries have passed laws like that recently, but Nigeria did not. Good for them. On to Mexico. Now, on paper, civil liberties in Mexico are protected by their constitution, just like they are in many consolidated democracies. For a long time, however, because of the PRI party's stranglehold on power, civil liberties, the freedoms we come to expect when we think of civil liberties and civil society groups, sometimes got restricted. And for example, for a long time, the ability of interest groups to lobby the government was highly regulated and controlled by the government, so to the point that it was considered to be a corporatist system. Interestingly, there was a major disaster in 1985. A severe earthquake hit Mexico City. Lots of people died, rubble everywhere. The government's response was basically, the best word would probably be incompetent. And this spurred kind of a movement in Mexico. Lots and lots of grassroots style community groups sprung up to take care of the problem and to pressure the government to make certain fixes to their infrastructure, etc. It was kind of obviously a very bad thing, but it was a catalyst for civil society in Mexico. And once that proved successful, the Mexican people pushed for other reforms, and it's too much to just pin it on one event like this, but it had a lot to do with some of the political reforms that came along that we've already studied, that made the political system open up a little bit and helped lead to eventually their multi-party system now. When it comes to interest groups, because of the PRI no longer has that monopoly on power anymore, we would consider their interest group scene to be pluralist and not corporatist. When it comes to authoritarian regimes, the picture is not quite so pretty. Civil liberties might be protected on paper, let's say, somewhere in their constitution, but in real life they are not respected, and therefore any sort of civil society group or interest group or NGO has a hard time getting anything done, even if they're allowed to legally exist. In China, the estimate is that there are 500,000 NGOs registered with the Chinese state. Informal groups added to that might be several times more. I've provided you with an article from The Economist from a few years ago that I think is a good source of information about civil society in China. I encourage you to read that. Basically, as you might expect, at the beginning of the Chinese communist regime in China under Mao, what we would call civil society practically did not exist. The government tried to control everything, very totalitarian. Eventually, Mao dies, and in the 1980s, a more economically liberal policy was put forward. Then came the Tiananmen Square incident, and the Chinese Communist Party realized that they had to keep strict political control, and have successfully done so for the last 30 or 40 years. Today, even the groups that are allowed to exist, they are heavily regulated and co-opted in every possible way you can think of, as a sign that the Chinese Communist Party just does not trust anything it does not control. So it allows these groups to exist, but does everything in its power to control what they do. When it comes to Iran, I hope you got this from our earlier lessons. What you kind of see in Iran is this sort of roller coaster where, depending on what president is elected or is allowed to be elected, let's say, the overall atmosphere of the country kind of goes through these changes, this kind of back and forth between what you call conservative or hardliner presidents with very restrictive policies, and more moderate or reformist-minded presidents with looser and more tolerant policies. For example, President Khatami, who served from 1997 to 2005, his 8 years in office saw a rise in civil society activity. They were treated with more tolerance, and things were kind of on the upswing there. Then Ahmadinejad got elected in 2005, probably the most severe and hard-line president they've had. And he was fully supported by the clerical elite, and there was a crackdown on civil society groups under Ahmadinejad. So his 8 years in power were not good for civil society. Under Rouhani for the last few years, things have improved slightly. But if you're watching Iranian politics closely, there's probably a pretty harsh conservative crackdown coming. If you don't happen to be Shia Islam in Iran, if you're Christian, Jewish, or Zoroastrian, you have a little more leeway given to you by the state. They are considered people of the book. I think that's the expression. But you got to be careful. Any sort of activity or anything you might publish, anything you might say that is interpreted to be anti-Islam or anti-regime, that stuff is banned outright. Women's groups, they've been trying hard for a long time in Iran to make progress on women's rights. But unfortunately, the story thus far is that very little progress has been made. In the hybrid regime of Russia, as you might expect, as part of their slide towards authoritarianism under Putin, independent, citizen-based activities are just, being much more harshly treated and controlled. There was a 2012 law that required any NGO operating in the country to register that received any sort of level of funding from abroad, which most NGOs operate globally, so some of their money would come from abroad. So pretty much every NGO in the country had to register as foreign agents. That law has been used to basically harass and intimidate, and in some cases shut down certain groups that Putin doesn't like. Just like he was able to take control of the media earlier in his career. And then lately they've adopted another strategy, which is, hey, let's have the Russian government provide the funding for all these groups, which on the surface might seem like, well, that's awful nice of them. On the other hand, it is really just a game. It's a plot to gain control of what those interest groups do. I read an article somewhere where someone quoted, here's the theory: mine hand will be the only hand that feeds you, otherwise you'll starve. So if you're an NGO trying to operate in Russia and your funding comes from Russia, basically that gives the Russian government control over what you do. Anyway, if a particular group does anything that the Russian government perceives as any sort of a threat, it will come under strict control. If it's a kind of a more community-based or social service-oriented kind of group, it's the kind of thing the Russian government will probably tolerate. But overall, the civil society scene in Russia is very weak. The next main topics here are political culture and political socialization. You may remember that political culture is basically what we all agree on, are widely shared attitudes about how a government is supposed to work. How are individuals supposed to be treated by the government? What freedoms are we going to enjoy? How are we supposed to participate in what the government does? We're going to have rule of law or rule by law. So those are the main questions we ask and talk about when we're talking about political culture. And in the 6 countries we study, we see a wide range of political cultures. Political socialization is the process by which we acquire our opinions and attitudes. In other words, how our political culture is transmitted from generation to generation. For most of us, at first, this process is pretty organic. It's just the question of which household we grow up in and what we get our opinions from our parents and our family. Eventually, we grow older, and the schools we go to, the courses we take, what we hear in the media, our religious organizations that we belong to, other things kind of then add on to what we start out with, the attitudes we start with. And democracies pretty much sort of let that happen on their own. Authoritarian governments typically explicitly put a lot of effort into making sure that each generation grows up with the proper, I used air quotes there, the proper political attitudes, the proper beliefs, so that everybody conforms to what the state wants. When it comes to China and Iran and their political cultures, both of them have a long history of autocracy, not much experience with democracy. So what you not surprisingly find among the people who live there is a political culture that's more tolerant, much more tolerant of authoritarian government, much more tolerant of the absence of civil liberties. And interestingly, they both have sort of national identities that are tied to past glorious episodes in their history. China was once upon a time, one of the most influential countries on earth. Iran, that was a while ago, but the Persian Empire was in its day powerful and influential. And both those countries kind of feed on that longing or nostalgia for former greatness. When it comes to socialization, both of them use the media, they use propaganda heavily, they use state-sponsored youth organizations, all sorts of ways to properly socialize their citizens, which basically means to instill in each generation faith in the ruling party or group, obedience to what they say. So we have some commonalities when it comes to China and Iran. And you see a similar strain in Russia's political culture, very long history of autocracy, practically no experience with democracy. There was a brief period in the 1990s when they experimented with democracy, and they seemed to really try to get it right. Then Putin comes along and derails the whole experiment. Also in Russia, you have a very strong strain of nationalism. Russia's history with its neighbors is pretty much been one of unbroken violence. Russians are distrustful and suspicious of people from other countries. So you see nationalism woven into their kind of natural acceptance of authoritarianism. We studied this earlier, and we used the word statist. Russian political culture is very statist. That means individuals are more likely to accept the need for a strong leader with lots of power to protect the country. Usually, in the past, it was from outside invaders. You could easily conjure up inner threats that a leader might use to keep the people in line. So, similar political cultures in China, Iran, and Russia. Mexico's political culture, even though it was a longtime colony of Spain, is a little more what we would recognize as proper for a democracy. Mexico is very proud of the fact that their revolution was the very first, in the 20th century anyway, the first, what they considered at the time to be a democratic revolution. That would be opposed to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But they were able to, for the most part, shake off their autocratic roots. No, they didn't really achieve it until recently, but they've they get an E for effort, let's say, and then lately, kind of layered on to what their existing political culture was, the economic liberalization of that came along with NAFTA in the mid-90s. That's become pretty much ingrained in what most Mexicans expect the behavior of their government to be. In the UK, they've been working on their constitutional monarchy for over 800 years, and by this point, they have a very long and respected tradition of respect for democratic processes and civil liberties. Nigeria, they've only been working at it for about 60 years now. They've had a much harder time developing what we would call a coherent political culture, for the most part, because it's an artificial country. It was the borders were drawn by European countries. It includes people who have no common bonds with each other. So the sense of Nigerianness or Nigerian national identity has been a hard thing for them to come by. Now, ideology is distinct from political culture. Political culture is what we agree on. Political culture is what we disagree on. There's a million issues out there that every government has to try to solve, and everybody has different attitudes about or opinions about what the government should do about this or that particular public policy issue. So political culture is the big ideas, democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law. Those are the great big ideas you agree on, and it basically governs how we think the government is supposed to work. Political ideology is about what is the government supposed to do about specific things. And then we have, on those issues, we have typically, different opinions. And if your opinions line up in certain ways, then we tend to call this collection of opinion by some label, a different collection of opinions by a different label. And these next words on the next slide will look pretty much familiar to you. Individualism or free marketism or capitalism, you can call it different things. Basically, a very important element of Western style thinking, at least to American ears. We believe strongly in the theory of natural rights. You're born with certain freedoms, and the government's role is to protect those freedoms and not to violate them. It's all part of the social contract. You'll see that more in Western cultures than in others. Now, the term neoliberalism might be confusing to some of you because when you see the word liberal, you think of the American definition of liberal, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. But it makes a big difference that there's 3 letters in front of it, neoliberalism. So let me maybe give an example that I think will make sense. You've heard of neo-Nazis. Well, the reason that today you have to put neo in front of it is because Nazis by itself doesn't exist anymore. Nazism by itself doesn't exist anymore. Nazis are all dead. The actual Nazis in history are all dead. So anybody who carries on with those beliefs today is a neo-Nazi. Neo means new. So if you use the same logic with neoliberalism, well, it means that there was a meaning of the word liberal or liberalism a long time ago, and neoliberalism is a return to those beliefs. The word neoliberalism doesn't have anything to do with Franklin Roosevelt or Bernie Sanders, because the word liberalism itself was used a few centuries ago to describe the set of beliefs that were common among people who wanted their societies then, at that time period, to escape the old model of monarchy and domination by the church and the class systems that were in place in the Middle Ages. Liberalism was the belief that we needed to move to democracy and individual freedom, free trade, private ownership, all that kind of stuff that was new. That was a new belief 200 or 300 years ago, when kings and queens still had a lot of power. So that was what the term liberalism originally meant. And now it's 200 or 300 years later, and the way we use the word liberal has changed. So now we have to put neo in front of it if we mean returning to limited government, liberalizing the economy in the sense of returning to private ownership, promoting free trade, eliminating restrictions imposed by the state. So it's different from liberalism by itself. Neoliberalism means a return to the attitude that we had when we were escaping monarchy a couple centuries ago. Communism we've studied. Basically, it's all revolves around abolishing private property and giving near total control of the economy to the government. Socialism is something a little short of that. Instead of giving total control over the economy to the government, you just give a lot of control over the economy to the government, and you try to create laws and systems that promote equality and reduce income disparities. You'll see the government providing more social services and maybe even owning some industries to make sure that everyone benefits from them. Fascism we've also discussed. Basically, it's hyper-nationalism, organized around the idea of a nation, and of course, the idea of a nation can mean defining a group of people by their religion or their ethnicity, and unfortunately, fascism often devolves into extreme persecution of certain ethnic minorities by the majority. The elevation of a certain person who symbolizes the ethnic majority as a leader, and giving the government lots of power over the minorities and anybody who opposes the regime. Populism we haven't talked much about. It's been used a lot lately, especially as Trump gathered popularity and eventually got elected. Populism doesn't refer to any sort of specific set of issues, like the government should do this or the government should do that. It's mostly about the perception that people have as to who is the group that's sort of usually in charge, and then there's everybody else. And populism pits those two groups against each other and claims to promote the interests of the common people over the people who have been perceived to have been in charge, or the elites. Also, in the College Board's curriculum for this course, there's in this unit some, as far as I can tell, some kind of randomly chosen concepts that they want you to know about. Rule of law versus rule by law. Now, we've covered this elsewhere, so I won't berate it here, except to notice that if you do poke around on an AP Classroom and look at some of the sample questions given by the College Board, I'm not sure that they were always consistent in how they use these words and formed their questions. So be careful if you notice that anything about the rule of law versus rule by law. The welfare state. Today, we would say the welfare state is the creation of liberal political ideology, meaning liberals today want the government to take more responsibility for providing certain social services like healthcare and education, sometimes housing, pensions. That would be an element of liberal ideology. However, notice the word of neoliberal. Neoliberal ideology means moving away from that back to private control, away from government control. And then there's post-materialism. I can't believe there'd be an essay question about this, maybe a multiple choice, but basically what it means is, the kind of issues that I'm going to use the word modern here. Countries that have kind of moved on from some of the older issues, and they're willing to tackle more detailed issues of equality and quality of life. The definition is there. Like I said, you don't hear this very much, but the College Board does want you to be aware of it. Political participation takes many forms. We're going to talk mostly about voting, but there's also signing petitions, protesting, boycotting, running for office. Lots of ways to politically participate. Participation can be voluntary, or it can be coerced or forced by the government. It can be supportive of the government in power. It can be opposed to the government in power. It can be formal, meaning you do it within existing procedures set by the state, or you can do it informally, meaning spontaneously as a matter of individual action. It can occur at the individual level. It can occur at group level. All regimes use a mix of political participation to get things done, and let's look at those in turn. Almost all the countries we study hold elections, but there's a big difference between the kind of elections that democratic regimes hold compared to the kind of elections that authoritarian regimes conduct. In democratic regimes, there's the genuine desire to give control over the government, control over policy-making process to the people themselves, either by picking representatives, or in some cases through referenda, where the people directly decide on specific policy decisions. In authoritarian regimes, those that do hold elections, there's a different agenda. Basically, they're holding these elections to enhance their legitimacy, because the word democracy has taken root as a positive thing, and they want to put on a show to make it look like they're being democratic, and that pleases some people. They'll hold elections to gather input. What that means is to just get a sense of what the people want. China actually does hold elections at local levels, in villages and neighborhoods and cities. And really what one of the things they want from these elections is to get a sense of, what are the people wanting at the grassroots level? What kind of people are they electing? What kind of issues are they motivated about? It's a way for the ruling party to sort of learn so they can adapt their policies if necessary. Authoritarian regimes also have this goal of kind of a bleeding off negative opinions of the regime in power, a safety valve. If you have the option of voting against the establishment people, then that might be a way for you to sort of blow off steam, get satisfaction from voting against somebody that the government wants to be in power. And if you are satisfied with that in some way, you're less likely to resist the regime in other ways. Elections in authoritarian governments give the illusion of the people having influence. Not too many people are tricked by this, but some are. The government will often limit who can run against the desired candidate. So you see that a lot in Iran and Russia. You see a lot of limiting through the media or by arresting people or whatever. You don't see much open discussion of issues. And then sometimes, if the usual means of managing elections to make sure the proper candidate wins, if that doesn't work, sometimes they'll just outright change the votes, hijack the counting process. That seems to have happened in Iran in 2009. It happens probably pretty regularly in Russia, at least in local elections, to make sure that, Putin minions get elected to be mayor of this or governor of that. There doesn't seem to have been much need for him to rig the elections at the national level that way, but who knows? There's also informal political participation. This is when people spontaneously take to the streets, sometimes in contravention of laws or instructions from the government. Democratic regimes typically tolerate this more willingly than authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes are not very tolerant of this, and they're much more likely to utilize violence. In authoritarian regimes, public order is more important than preserving or protecting rights. So you see lots of episodes in this. In Iran, the Green Movement protests of 2009, that would have been Ahmadinejad's second election. His re-election was pretty much completely fraudulent. Nobody really believes that he actually won the election, but he was declared the winner, and people took the streets in protest, and violence ensued. In 2019 in Iran, the worsening economy caused for widespread protests throughout Iran, protesting economic conditions and the high high cost of life, and we're still kind of tallying up the death toll, but we do know that the regime met those protests with violence. In China, in 1989, everyone knows what happened in Tiananmen Square, at least anybody who's not in China. The Hong Kong protests were at times violent and fatal. And currently in Xinjiang, an entire region of the country has been put under complete and total lockdown, as we studied earlier. And in Russia, Putin encountered some pretty persistent and long-lasting protests. Some of it was specifically directed towards Putin himself. Some of it was directed towards just the fact that democracy wasn't truly democracy over there, that the elections were being managed by the Russia United Party. And there were also protests last year in 2019, pretty much economically motivated, also partly motivated by local elections. We'll talk about this later, but the violence that occurred in Iran and China was not specifically echoed or followed in Russia. Civil liberties we've talked about before. Basically, civil liberties include what we consider to be individual freedoms that are supposed to be guaranteed and respected and not violated by the government. Freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, that sort of thing, plus due process rights when it comes to the rights of the accused. The degree to which governments adhere to their paper restrictions, the degree to which governments actually respect and refrain from violating civil liberties is pretty much that's how we determine how far along the spectrum or continuum that a country is going from democratic to authoritarian. Unfortunately, violations of civil liberties are pretty easy to find in the countries we study. For example, in China, we all know about we've already covered this, complete ignoring of due process rights in their legal system. Y'all heard of the Great Wall of China? Well, there's something called the Great Firewall. A firewall is an electronic, a digital screening that lots of networks employ, but China walls itself off from the rest of the world when it comes to the internet, and uses the technology of the internet to surveil its citizens, and then also to block them from getting certain information. Just ask Winnie the Pooh. They use facial recognition software in connection with their surveillance cameras during the protests in Hong Kong last year. And then, of course, we already talked about this in Xinjiang, what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs is truly, there's no other way to describe it other than Orwellian. Similar situation in Iran. Their legal system has just almost no such thing as due process in any way. It's really not it's not really a legal system. It's an oppression system used by the clerical elites and the Revolutionary Guard to put their enemies in jail. I just read an article the other day. There's some guy in Iran who has just been put in prison. I think it's for several weeks and months now. He hasn't done anything wrong. They haven't even charged him with anything. What they want is for his daughter, who's in exile, lives outside the country, but continues to criticize the regime. I think she's a journalist or a reporter or something. So the government can't get at her, but the next best thing is to arrest her dad and just hold him. And he's apparently in a very notorious prison, and I doubt is being treated very well. Anyway, that goes on all the time in Iran. And then also, kind of like the Great Firewall in China, Iran puts a lot of effort into controlling what people see and do on in social media and on certain websites. And we talked about the Green Movement, the 2009 protests against that fixed presidential election that year. And then last year, like I said earlier, the gas price protests of 2019. We do know that it was met by violence by the government, and like I said, we're still kind of counting up the bodies. Violations of civil liberties are rampant in Russia as well, as we know. Not only is the Russian judiciary firmly under Putin's control, and he routinely uses it to harass and intimidate his political opponents going all the way back to the Khodorkovsky episode in the early 2000s. We talked about the anti-Putin and anti-managed elections protests of 2011, 2012, 2013. But at least Putin doesn't seem to have the same appetite for killing his own people that they do in China and Iran. He tends to take a more hands-off, a more selective way of controlling the population of Russia. He tends to let things die down, and then he just sort of persecutes certain individuals that he perceives as being the leaders. He'll get Parliament to pass certain laws that impose more controls over, assembling and protesting or uses of the media. And then also what you've seen since 2013, 2014, is more of a nationalist element to Putin's propaganda, and the personality cult that's been building around him for years has become more intense too, as a way of getting people to basically do what they're told. In Nigeria, the government is not nearly as inherently evil as the ones in China or Iran. But they do have a huge problem with what's called Boko Haram. It's a terrorist group that operates mostly in northern Nigeria that basically is just indiscriminate, you name it, killing, kidnapping, mass murder. I'm not going to even try to explain their goals. They don't make any sense. It was really, really bad 10 years ago, 8, 9 years ago. Hasn't been as bad lately as presidents have gotten elected with the specific goal of doing something about this. But the efforts by the Nigerian government to deal with Boko Haram have not been entirely effective. Boko Haram is still an ongoing threat to millions of people, mostly in northern Nigeria. The government does not do a good enough job of protecting citizens and life, right to life, is an important civil liberty. And then even in the government itself has been guilty of violations in their pursuit of Boko Haram. In their attempts to wipe out Boko Haram, they've resorted, the army mainly, has resorted to some questionable tactics. And so when you see a civil liberty score for Nigeria, there's at least a good couple of reasons why they don't score so well in this aspect of democracy. Mexico is unfortunately a little similar to Nigeria, mostly a positive record on civil liberties. But Mexico's problems is the drug cartels. The drug cartels basically operate with impunity, and unfortunately what that means is sometimes when they decide somebody needs to go, they're gone. Lots and lots of episodes of violence, lots of examples of murder and mass murder over the years, and the government can't stop it. And in some cases, the government's even a part of it. I think we talked about an episode a few years ago of 40-something students at a teacher's college got on a bus to go to Mexico City, and they haven't been seen since. And there's some question about whether they were killed by accident by the drug lords, or if they were killed on purpose with the complicity of maybe members of the police, because I think they were headed to a protest or something. Anyway, pretty grim stuff happening in Mexico too. And in the UK, not much to talk about here. A few years ago, the government cut a lot of the funding for secondary education, and there were protests by college age young people protesting the austerity measures being implemented by the government at that time. There was some, vandalism and stuff, but it's not like the other countries where the police stepped in and started killing people. Some people were caught and punished, but for the most part, comparatively non-violent, at least compared to the other countries. The College Board wants you, as part of this unit, to understand the concept of transparency, which we've also talked about. Transparency in real life is the ability to see through something. So when it comes to government, it's the ability to see into the government to find out what it's doing and why it's doing it. Transparency is a good thing. It helps the people maintain their control over their own government. Authoritarian governments do not practice transparency in any sense. They want their decision-making processes to be secret and closed off from the public so they can basically do anything they want. The UK, Mexico, and Nigeria all have versions of the what it's called in the United States a Freedom of Information Act, which basically means you, as a person or a member of the media, you have access to finding out getting physical records, who was at the meeting, who decided this, what information was in possession of whom. In the United States, we have a pretty effective implementation of that law, also in the UK. Mexico and Nigeria are kind of working on it, but at least the laws exist. Like Nigeria, like everything else in Nigeria, is prone to corruption. You can request records from a certain government agency, but then you probably have to pay somebody off. When it comes to governments like Russia, Iran, and China, don't even think about it. Don't exist. Same kind of breakdown shows up when it comes to restrictions on the media. The UK, Mexico, and Nigeria have fairly free, protection. The press is pretty well protected in those countries, except for Mexico, where you have it's not the government they have to be afraid of, but it's the drug lords you have to be afraid of if you're a reporter. China, no such thing as not even a hint of media freedom there. Again, just ask Pooh. Iran exerts very strict control over media outlets, etc., and Russia too. Now it's a big country, so Putin makes sure that the national media, TV stations and radio stations that operate nationally, and newspapers are always local, but internet news sites, they are all under his strict control. There's a little more freedom at the local level, but pretty much anything that Putin doesn't like ends up being silenced. The last major topic in this unit is social cleavages. A cleavage is a division. And we talk about social cleavages or political cleavages in a country when they have divisions within their population based on class or ethnicity or religion or territory or gender or anything like that. Anything that causes people, as we look at them as members of groups, to have significantly different attitudes on various political issues compared to other groups. Every country has these sorts of cleavages, either because of just the way their population happens to be composed, or sometimes it's in reaction to something the government has actually done. We've studied most of these already, but just to review, social cleavages in China. The Han majority, I think it's 90-something% of the population, but there are a significant number of ethnic minorities, such as the Uyghurs and Tibetans, and then also geographically, you can identify divisions because of the starkly different level of economic development, income inequality between groups, and usually this breakdown is summarized various ways as urban versus rural. The rural areas tend to be much poorer than the urban areas. You can also describe it as coastal versus the interior, meaning it's the coastal cities and the coastal regions that are doing well economically, and the interior regions that are not, which is more rural. You can also call it east versus west, because the east coast of China is where all the development is, and then in the west it's more rural and more poor. In Iran, the social cleavages are more along religious lines. Basically, the Shia majority doesn't treat its enemies very gently. By law, like we've said this already, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians are given official recognition and some rights to practice freely. Although, don't take the word freely too literally. But even within Islam, there's differences between the Shia majority and the Sunni minority, and sometimes those differences are uglier than the other ones. There's also ethnic cleavages in Iran. Ethnic Persians occupy the same country as a majority, with Azerbaijanis and Kurds and other smaller ethnic groups, and there is some friction along those lines that the Iranian government does its best to keep on a low boil. In Mexico, as we've already talked about, the biggest the ethnic division is between the Mestizo majority and the Amerindian minority. There's also regional divisions that we've talked about. Most of the economic development over the last 20 or 30 years has happened in the north. So it's there where most of the wealth is concentrated, where the economic development has been most pronounced. It's in the south that where poverty persists on a much wider scale. Remember the Zapatistas of Chiapas state who protested the NAFTA treaty. So you can call the division a north-south division. You can also call it an urban-rural because there are significant differences between the levels of wealth found in most cities compared to rural areas. In Nigeria, they should just call the country, Cleavageville. There's so many different ethnic groups, language groups, religious groups. Like we said earlier, the country is an artificial country. It probably shouldn't exist, but it does. And the borders that were drawn by European countries have included lots of groups that just don't get along very well. The biggest groups the House of Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. A lot of conflict between those groups. And then there's the geographic / religious division between the predominantly predominantly Muslim North and the predominantly Christian South, which is made worse or exacerbated by the fact that it's in the South where most of the wealth is, and it's in the north where most of the poverty is. Russia as well, like Nigeria, has 100-something definable different and distinct ethnic groups. Now, 80% of the population is ethnically Russian and linguistically Russian. Russia is the official language. But that leaves a lot of people, and by the way, also Russian Orthodox, but that leaves a lot of people out, and some of these groups don't like how they've been treated by the Russians over the years. The most prominent example of that is the Chechens in the southern Caucasus region. It's also religiously distinct, as that region is predominantly Muslim. Russia fought 2 wars against Chechnya in the early 2000s. And to this day, it's an area of concern because Russia continues to endure and experience terrorist attacks by Muslim extremists, mostly in the southern region of the country. And even in the UK, we will remember that there's lots of national divisions. Remember, the word nation refers to not a country or a state. It refers to a group of people with something culturally in common with each other. So there's important nationalistic cleavages in the UK. There's the regional groups, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish. That's been, those groups have been able to push for some degree of their own political control. You remember the term devolution. And the first group to get, some level of control over themselves politically was the Northern Irish. I want to say 1997 was the Good Friday Agreement between various factions in Northern Ireland. That was the Protestants and Catholics killing each other all over the place. And part of that agreement was to give Northern Ireland its own assembly with some independent powers from Parliament over themselves. There's also a little racial tension. The country is vastly majority white, but because of Great Britain's colonial history, there are significant populations from India and Pakistan and other places that Great Britain has, in its colonial period, run and had dominion over the years. So there are some ethnic cleavages along those lines as well. And that's it. Hope you found it useful, and I encourage you to keep at it, study hard. AP tests are coming up. See you in the next video.